Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Community-Driven Litigation. My name is Pat Malone. I'm Associate Director at the Immigration Advocates Network. We create our own tools, build platforms, and work with partners to better support immigrants and their advocates. In terms of logistics today, our presentation will be about an hour long, with your questions submitted to the chat box on the panel to your right. More or less, we'll hold your questions till the end, just to give the presenters some time to maybe cover what you might want to know. And otherwise, we will invite you to participate in this conversation. At the end of the webinar, we will edit and post it to our website so that you can enjoy a recorded version at www.immigrationadvocates.org. So I'm very pleased to turn it over to our moderator today, Sukti Dhital, who is the Executive Director of the Robert and Helen Bernstein Institute for Human Rights at New York University School of Law. Sukti will introduce herself, Justice Power, and our panelists. Welcome, Sukti.
Thank you so much, Pat, and many thanks to Ian and for all of you out there joining us, and of course to our panelists. As Pat mentioned, my name is Sukti Dhital. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bernstein Institute at NYU Law School. It's a total honor and a privilege to serve as the moderator for today's session, which is done in partnership with Ian, Beyond Legal Aid, and Organized Communities Against Deportation, also known as OCAD. I'm going to start by introducing the panel topic, the speakers, and the format for today's session, and then we will get started. So thank you again for being with us. So as the description set forth, today we're really going to learn how community organizers and attorneys can work together to advance litigation led by the experience and the expertise of those directly impacted. Our panelists are going to share strategies and tactics to build strong partnerships that are rooted in equity and empowerment, and also reflect honestly about the challenges in doing this work and the opportunities that come from co-designing grassroots litigation cases and campaigns. To take us deep into this work, we have a fabulous group of social justice warriors who think creatively and think intentionally about how to do community-driven work to not only build power, but to also advance immigrant justice. We're going to hear from Antonio Gutierrez, who is the co-founder and coordinator of strategic development and operations at OCAD. At OCAD, Antonio addresses structural needs and facilitates the organization's sustainable growth. They became involved with OCAD as part of the Immigrant Youth Justice League and have over 5 years of nonprofit administration development experience. And Antonio is also the co-founder of the Albany Park Defense Network and the Autonomous Tenant Union. You want to wave, Antonio? Next up, also sharing insights from OCAD, we have Xanat Sobrevilla. Xanat leads OCAD's deportation defense work. She coordinates legal intakes and appointments, manages the collaboration of a hotline, and acts as an intermediary with the network of attorneys that OCAD works with. Her input on legal strategy strengthens OCAD's organizing efforts with a deep focus on integration of families who are facing deportation. We also have with us Lam Ho. Lam is the executive director and co-founder of Beyond Legal Aid. Lam has been engaged in legal advocacy work for more than 12 years, and prior to founding Beyond, worked at a number of legal aid organizations and experienced firsthand the challenges of community lawyering, and was inspired with that to think through what a community activism lawyering model looks like. And so we'll hear more about that soon. Lam, you want to give us a wave? And then finally with us is Wally Hilke, who is a staff attorney at Beyond. Wally's been with Beyond since 2018, serves as a community lawyer supporting a range of different work ranging from immigration, family, housing, and civil rights law, and has a deep focus on challenging police violence and misconduct. As mentioned, today's webinar is part of Justice Power's teach-in series on legal empowerment. If you can go to the next slide. Justice Power is a network of community organizers and lawyers who partner with immigrant communities to build power and advance immigrant justice. And what this network does and what this site does, justicepower.org, which we can share afterwards, really uplifts the work of these organizations who are thinking, as I mentioned, very intentionally about how to partner with communities for communities to understand the law, to be able to use it, and then to be able to shape and transform the law and systems more broadly. So before we get started, we'd love to get a sense of who's in the room with us. And so we have a few poll questions to keep this a little exciting. And so we'll start with the first poll question, which was asked in the registration. If you could, how many of you out there are community organizers, lawyers, researchers, and the catch-all other category?
All right, I'm going to keep the poll open for a few more seconds, and then we'll close it and show our audience results.
Great. Oh, wow, the majority of folks are other. That's fascinating. I'd love it if people could chat in what the other is, but really good to know. 9% organizers, 9% researchers, 41% attorneys. Next question is, how many of you engage in litigation with community-based groups? Or do you engage in litigation with community-based groups? Yes or no? That's an easier one.
Okay, I'm going to leave it open for a couple more seconds and then close and share the results.
So great, the numbers show 62% no and 38% yes. So maybe after this webinar, those numbers will increase. And the last question is, how many out there are you familiar with legal empowerment?
All right, I'm about to close the poll and share the results.
Okay, very similar to the last poll. Thanks, everybody. Now, Pat, if you could go to the next slide. So before I turn the mic over to the folks you came here to listen to, I'd like to briefly ground the discussion in what we mean by legal empowerment and how it relates to immigration work here in the US. So if we zoom out at the global level, I think recent figures from May of 2019 found that there were more than 5 billion people who are living without meaningful access to justice in the world. One can imagine that that number is greater now with the impact of the pandemic, but that's a pretty staggering figure. And legal empowerment is a rights-based methodology that really strives to change that number, to reimagine a world where people who are impacted are at the center of justice systems, are kind of the heart of what beats a legal ecosystem, and are empowered to know the law, to use the law, and to shape and transform the laws that affect their lives. The field finds its roots in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa in the 1950s, and has since really grown into a global movement with thousands of organizations in over 100 countries engaged in community-led justice efforts. In 2018, the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, where I am, in partnership with the Global Justice Clinic at NYU, began a journey to really document and make visible some of the legal empowerment strategies that immigrant rights organizations are engaged in across the US, to really make visible and uplift the work that is oftentimes seen as periphery to traditional legal advocacy efforts. And so we went on this journey with many of the folks who are on this call to really document some of these strategies that we think are both powerful and should be learned from and ideally adopted, not only in immigration, but in other fields as well. And those strategies are now living on the Justice Power website, and they span things like accompaniment programs, pro se legal clinics, know your rights trainings, community-based hotlines, tech innovation. There's 9 of them in total, and today we're really going to go deep into community-driven litigation. And so we urge you to take a look at the website and then reach out to us if you have any questions, or if you're an organization that wants to kind of learn more. We are a coalition that seeks and embraces others to join us on this. And so I will now pass it over to our friends at OCAD and beyond. They'll share more about their approaches, reflect on the partnership, and also reflect on some lessons learned that they're excited to share with all of you. We'll be doing that for the next 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll come back for question and answer. And there is a question box for those of you out there. If you could please submit those questions, and I'll definitely be tracking them with Pat, and then we'll make sure to highlight them when we open up for Q&A. So on that note, I am passing it over to you, Antonio.
Thank you, Sukti, and thank you everybody that joined us today for this webinar. My name is Antonio Gutierrez. I prefer they, them, their pronouns, and as mentioned before, I'm the strategic coordinator of OCAD. And OCAD is an undocumented-led group organization in Chicago, Illinois. A lot of our work centers around deportations, detention, and criminalization as well. And we do this through grassroots organizing, both unifying legal and policy work, direct action, civil disobedience, and cross-movement building. We aim to defend our communities, challenge the institutions that target and that humanize us, and build collective power. We fight alongside families and individuals challenging these systems to create an environment for our communities to thrive, work, organize, and live without fear. And so with that, next slide.
Hi, this is Xanat, Sobrevilla, also an organizer with OCAD. So a little bit of how we organize and support people in deportation proceedings. As mentioned, we are directly impacted individuals ourselves as well. Some of us are undocumented, some of us have DACA, some of us are formally undocumented. And so with that, we enter the work. We know that we must and need to support the individuals and the families navigate this complex and chaotic process that's immigration proceedings or a deportation. And so oftentimes we fill the role of trying to support the individuals either emotionally, logistically, kind of grounding the issues they're facing and seeing it more as a collective movement or a network of people challenging that with them. We try to connect people with legal support when that's possible and available, and it's, you know, there's an opportunity within the case to help that individual challenge their deportation proceedings or the violations they have been submitted to. We try to gather and support also individuals, help gather personal documents, proof, and that has to do with knowing that a lot of times, especially here in Illinois, representation and legal support is not that available or accessible. And also just, we know that a lot of the communities that are impacted by deportation proceedings, you know, when you have the breadwinner or this happened to you, all the chaos that ensues, it's very difficult to then have to deal with documents and meetings and all of that. We also think and try to work strategically, supporting the family and framing the story, pushing the story publicly. For us, it's always about how does that also push us collectively in movement work. Sometimes we are able to identify civil rights violations or policies that could change. So we try to always try to see the root of the issue, with whether it was the health of someone being criminalized, or it was an operation where we saw abuses, outrageous abuses by ICE in the process. So always trying to have a lens and perspective to do that. We also try to get support from national institutions. We know that our work here in Chicago is not isolated. We know that there's a lot of resistance in other states and other cities. Also, the political atmosphere might be different, but I think knowing that ICE is a national entity and we see it play out a little bit differently, we also know that we must be in communication and support, and also the ideas that come from different places, we learn and feed from each other. So we try to also build on that. And then we've also been tried to be instruments of physically abrupting the process of deportation. So we see ourselves also as that potential within someone's deportation, and that sometimes also just means uplifting the outrage and the case and what happens. We know that sometimes documenting this in the public eye is just as an essential and empowering way to support the families in our communities. Next slide.
So besides our anti-deportation campaign work that Xanat just explained, we also are part of different coalitions that address the aspect of criminalization to immigrant communities. So we are part of the Sanctuary for All demand in the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago currently is a sanctuary city, but there are 4 exceptions when ICE can still collaborate with law enforcement or vice versa. And so we're trying to eliminate these carvas. As one can imagine, these carvas are based on criminal record and warrants. And so as OCAD, we form a coalition and we're trying to get those exceptions to be eliminated from the sanctuary city ordinance in the city of Chicago. We also work on the gang database and eliminating the Chicago Police Department gang database, which is still an ongoing work. And Wally here actually has been key in some of the litigation around that. And currently, we're also starting a campaign around surveillance tools and how they're used to criminalize communities of color, more specifically during COVID-19, as we see a lot of the funds that cities are receiving, not just in Chicago, but across the nation, to use in order to increase surveillance on communities of color and addressing that to the public so that we're aware about what that surveillance looks like. And we have a mutual aid fund right now for undocumented families that need financial assistance currently due to COVID-19 effects in their jobs. Next slide.
Yeah, and all the policy work or the campaigns that we engage with come from individual cases or individual fights that we have here and we're supporting. And so that's how we feel we can make a case stronger. Sometimes it's identifying, again, root issues and trying to then obstruct deportation proceedings as a result. As Antonio mentioned, we're in the gang database campaign, and we're in it because we saw the Chicago gang database initiate a deportation proceeding for someone who's now an organizer here with us. So that's how we try to identify things that connect to the anti-criminalization work and to surveillance and rooted that way, make connections of individuals' experiences to the larger movement. And that's also how we frame public messaging. We've had cases where a DUI has also been used to justify the removal proceedings and the prolonged detention of someone. And so for us, it's important to ground it on a health issue and not an issue that the criminal system or immigration system should address in such a harmful manner. We also try to have conversations around that. We vision as OCAD, we believe that we can live in a place where we can freely move, feel safe, and be free of criminalization. So with that, we always try to frame our cases with that goal and doing the critiques that can help us challenge the systems that we currently have. Who are our allies, likely and unlikely? I think it depends on the case and what we think is important to highlight in that specific case. Sometimes we're in the case of DUIs and trying to frame it around a health issue as opposed to a criminal issue, then when it's the public health members in our communities. If it's around a conversation around what we need in our city to be safe and challenge ICE, then maybe it's a religious community through sanctuary. We also know that our liberation as immigrants, as undocumented immigrants, is very highly dependent on the liberation of Black community. And so we know that we must also show up in those movement and issues, because it impacts us. And so I would say our allies, centering always directly impacted individuals, and also we know the value of allies. As OCAD, we're also trying to support the rapid response teams. And here in Chicago, in the South Side, we have in Little Village, there's a rapid response team, and it's a Latinx community, so it's Latinx majority. In the North Side, we have the rapid response team at Albany Park Defense Network, and it's half of the people there are in proceedings, and half of the people and others are white, and so they're also sharing their resources, trying to address ICE in our communities. And what strategies can we use to stop their deportation? I mean, we've tried legal strategies, challenging court support throughout the immigration proceedings, also through the civil rights claims. We've done phone banking, challenging, targeting the individuals making decisions on a case, and that could be ICE officers, it could be, yeah, mostly ICE officers. We've done press conferences, and as Antonio mentioned, we do direct action too. When we feel like there's people that must make decisions and we need to highlight the injustices, we've physically tried to obstruct buses leaving for the border. Vast majority of strategies, but always trying to highlight and uplift what we see as root issues and trying to go for that vision. Next slide.
I guess this it's our turn at Beyond Legal Aid. So as Sukti mentioned, I'm Lam. I go by he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Beyond Legal Aid. So at Beyond, I think our work is really to interrogate how legal aid and legal aid lawyers do our work. Who gets access? How and where is it provided? And what are the goals of the work? And with all of that, we're really thinking about how to be better in not only really empowering communities, but also to recognize and leverage the power that existed in these communities long before and long after lawyers are a part of the conversation. And the way that we do that is to work with communities that have limited access to legal aid to help them build their own program so that they don't have to rely upon legal organizations. They can have programs that they are in their communities, that they run, and most importantly, control and make decisions for. Next slide, please. So currently at Beyond Legal Aid, we have over 20 what we call community activism law programs, and all of those programs operate independently with their own brands and identity. So for example, one of our programs is the Community Empowerment Legal Clinic, which I'm wearing the t-shirt for, which is a partnership with the Vietnamese Association of Illinois. And all these programs are community located. So from the moment that a community member comes to seek legal assistance, to trial prep, to follow-up meetings, debriefing after a hearing, all that is going to occur in community spaces. They're also community operated, which means we send our lawyers to work in these spaces, but it's the community organization with which we partner who run the actual program. So they will always have someone to serve, to provide screenings, to do reception, to provide language support. Our attorneys are essentially there to facilitate the running of these programs by our community partner. It means that they have ownership in these programs. At the same time, they also have to invest in these programs, since not only do they have to provide space, but they also have to provide most of the manpower for the operations of these programs. And the reason that we hope they do it is because unlike having a legal organization come in and have a satellite office, these are programs that they get to make all the decisions for. So who's eligible for services, what hours we work, where we work, what types of cases we take on, what are the priorities in terms of deciding which case to take and which case to not take. That is all made by our community partner, since it's their program. Next slide, please. And so those, I just talked to you about our programs. Now I'm going to share a little bit with you some of the core values and principles we have around the actual legal work that we complete through these programs. I refer to it as sort of empowering communities by depowering lawyers. And what I mean by that is that we take a starting point of really challenging what we are taught in law school, which is a model of lawyering that's based upon lawyers being in charge of transactions with clients who are there to receive help. And that's what we're really trying to challenge and create a new paradigm. And in doing so, we really think that it really is focused around shifting this idea of lawyers having all the power and lawyers having all the control to a process that we think is more around lawyers recognizing with great humility that their work is just one part of a much larger process, and litigation or other work that we do as lawyers is just one tool in a very much larger toolbox. And for us as lawyers, we're not going into communities to be the powerful transaction processors. Rather, we're going into communities to really recognize, here are the skills that we have, but here are also our limitations. Here's how we have to learn. And through that process, we hope that lawyers can be transformed, because not only are they changing the way that they think about power and their the power dynamics in their relationships with communities and community members, but they're also learning additional skills. And they're going to be transformed by what they're learning from working with communities and community members who have a very different set of skills. And through that transformation, they're going to really relearn that lawyering is at heart problem solving. And problem solving has multiple solutions. And litigation, working as a lawyer, going into courts is just one part of what it means to solve a problem. We're not going to create social change. We're not going to change systems. We're not going to change the world just going into courts. So how do we as lawyers really problem solve these bigger problems that we can't address if we don't learn what all the tools are to actually solve the challenges that we face? So as part of this, we really think in terms of understanding the work we do in a legal empowerment frame, we're going to reshape the law and lawyering by really saying lawyers, judges, the legal system shouldn't have all the control. We should really be passing a lot of this power that exists in the legal system and the legal process to those who can actually problem solve more effectively, more impactfully than what we can do. So with that, can we have the next slide? And I think bring back our partners at the Organized Communities Against Deportation.
Yes, and so we want to offer two examples where Beyond and OCAD have collaborated. Two cases, very recent cases for us and active cases for us. So the first one we wanted to share was the fight to have Beto home with us. Beto is the brother of one of our organizers. And last summer, coming back from a camping trip in Iowa, he and his friends were pulled over, a traffic violation, were given the reasoning around speeding. And Beto, after that interaction with the police there, was placed in proceedings and detained. And so for us, of course, it was really important to challenge and support Beto, as he's part of our family, literally, and also challenge what came after. So what came after is Beto is someone who qualifies for DACA, who as soon as ICE was told that he was DACA eligible, should have been released, as their website says, and their process says. And so when that did not happen, and then that turned into 9 months of detention, that 9 months we were going to Nebraska to the immigration hearings many times, asking the immigration judge, allow for the DACA renewal to proceed. We did that through court support. So we had ourselves, we would often drive with other allies and community supporters. And then also in Iowa and Nebraska, we met organizers there as well, that also rallied behind Beto, and we would often show up, do press conference, announce what the process of we were expecting and what happened throughout that process, documenting everything and making sure we elevate and make it so that this is not something that's happening behind doors and in a cloud of and so yes, Beto at the same time was also organizing inside. He was letting us know the detention conditions and letting us know how people were being processed and treated. He even at one point did a collective letter, and about like 36 people inside signed it. So he became a more active organizer inside. We of course had also panels and public conversations here in Chicago. He would call in and he would speak as well. So he became very active in terms of detention conditions. And then when the immigration proceedings were coming to a close, we partnered with Beyond. We were seeing that we needed USCIS to adjudicate this DACA. We needed for Beto to be released and be able to have a chance to renew his DACA and be with his family in Chicago. We struggled many times getting his case back in Chicago, where it would be easier to connect and work with Beto. And so I'll let Wally explain a little bit of that litigation and the arguments that we were making. But all to say that when we got Beto back after 9 months, we were so excited. We were able to negotiate bond for him. And it's an active and continuing fight because ICE didn't like that we were winning. And so just last month, beginning of June, Beto was redetained and deported. That of course doesn't finish there. We know that there is a potential to bring him back, and rightly so, because of how it all developed. And so our organizing and communication continues. Beto continues being part of our comité here of people, of our asambleas that we have meetings in Chicago. And so yes, Wally, if you want to share a bit of the legal strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Xanat. Again, I'm Wally. I use he, him, and I'm a staff attorney and Beyond Legal Aid, and was part of Beto's legal team for what is actually approaching a year now. I'm trying to think about where the best place is to start. When OCAD and Beto came to us to work on his case, we knew that he had been wronged, and he was very aware of how ICE had ignored its own policies, of how an immigration judge had misapplied the law, causing his wrongful and continued detention. And OCAD had already done so much work to put pressure on ICE and to continue the fight. We knew he had been wronged, but we didn't know exactly how to fix it. So we tried to do everything. This was our kitchen sink case. And so we filed a federal lawsuit in Chicago saying ICE has to be held to its own rules, as any agency does. We filed a habeas lawsuit in Minnesota saying he's been detained for too long, and he was moved, right? Immigration jail is moving from one place to another. We sued in Minnesota to say he's been held too long and without any chance of bond. And we also picked up his immigration defense case as the immigration proceedings continued. But I think I want to focus on how working with organizers like Organized Communities Against Deportation and doing this style of lawyering, and we'll talk more about what we've learned in the next section, but just a few reflections on what I think really helped inform our strategy to win the victories that we did, and also to guide how we continue to fight. I think the first thing is that working with community organizers, like organizers know better than anyone how to figure out who your target is, who has the power to make the decision that you need, and what are the tools that you can find to put pressure on them to make that decision. So even as we were pursuing these different legal avenues, it was all rooted in who can make the decision to bring Beto home, who can make the decision to renew his DACA, and keeping that end in mind. And when you've found, because it's not just that a judge is going to give you the thing that you want, it's also that how you proceed in your litigation and how the organizing goes can, as happened in our case, lead to the agency itself making a decision that helps you achieve your goal. And so when Beto was released on bond, when together we all won a new bond hearing and a bond set, it was because we had thought enough that the government conceded that he should get a new bond hearing, and they made the choice to do that without being forced to, by a judge, but instead by the power of what organizers accomplished and we supported through our work. I think that there are so many things that are different about doing this kind of work together, but for me, one of the biggest themes is that moving at the speed of trust, which is not an original idea, but something that people in this space talk about, that community organizers bring so much to the table in terms of being able to put on pressure and actually understand the systems that you're fighting. And as lawyers, we bring our own skills and knowledge to the table. But Xanat was talking about, Beto is this powerful advocate who fought and is fighting his case, not just for his own benefit, but so that no one is harmed by ICE ever again, so that everyone in his situation, sort of for the betterment of everyone in his situation. And that's something he's talked about in terms of what inspired him to stay in detention for 9 months, when at any time he could have signed a piece of paper and returned and been sent to Mexico, not knowing what the outcome would be in this case. That just spending the time, and it is a lot of time, to talk to each other, to understand all the parts of what you're doing, to lay out like legal concepts that can be confusing even for lawyers as your understanding of a case and the options may evolve. I think those were all really important parts of the strategy as we embarked on this complex, like multi-jurisdictional, going state to state project of bringing Beto home, which we did, and trying to get him the right to stay, for which the fight is continuing. So I'll close that there, but there's certainly a lot more to say. And let's go to the next slide, unless we have anything else on this case study. Yeah, let's go to the next slide.
Awesome. The second case study that we want to bring up is the case of Francisco Silvia. Francisco is a father and a husband that is a resident of the Albany Park Community Neighborhood area that we kind of brought up as well beginning of this webinar. Francisco came to us, to OCAD, back in 2015. He had received his second DUI. And I hope that all of us here in this webinar can also know and be aware of how substance misuse is a representation of how the trauma that people had endured based on the system that we face. But when OCAD started talking to Francisco and his family around what an anti-deportation campaign looked like, we also wanted to highlight that DUI checkpoints throughout the city of Chicago are mostly placed in communities of color. And even though there's no real proof that really says that people of color misuse substances more than, for example, white individuals or white communities. And so we wanted to highlight that as part of the campaign, and then humanizing the deportation case through the story of Francisco itself. We also saw a collaboration between the Juliet prison, which is outside the Chicagoland area, and how clearly those prisons outside the Chicagoland area were collaborating with ICE, right? He was arrested for the DUI, and as soon as he was released or discharged from the prison itself, ICE was waiting for him to detain him again, and he never really was able to go home. Through our campaign, we were able to not only like kind of hold that deportation and for him to be with his family while he was going through the deportation proceedings, but later on then encounter a checkpoint last August of 2019 where he was detained without any reason given to the legal team and to OCAD and to himself, other than he supposedly was somebody of like public kind of charge, or like something about like how he was like a threat to public security, right? And no real reasoning behind that other than this DUI criminal record. That is somebody, for me personally, resonates a lot, right? As I also have a DUI from back in 2011. Because of that, I was not able to apply to DACA like program. And so we see these connections about how like criminal record or criminalization of immigrants are used for ICE or to ICE to give a tool in order to put us in proceedings and also like not give us the same benefits or relief as other individuals. And it kind of resembles in this like rhetoric around good versus bad immigrants, that as OCAD we continue to fight that rhetoric, as we believe all undocumented immigrants deserve a chance to thrive in their communities in the United States, and that we need to stop all deportations. But with that, I want to give it to Beyond's legal team to talk about the motions that we filed after he was detained during that check-in in August of 2019, and this aspect of getting him out of bond as well.
So I'm going to, from the legal perspective, I think I can start by saying the work that we did for Francisco's case was really focused around getting Francisco bond and then pursuing the immigration remedy of cancellation of removal. Given the time limitations, I assume everyone is familiar with that, so I won't go too much into the details of it. What I do want to go into is the really important and at times really challenging work of community-driven litigation from our perspective, because we're really focused on making sure that any litigation that we do is directed by the goals and the agenda of the organizing. And that actually means on a logistical level that we want and are open and work with our community partners to make decisions around litigation. And that's definitely a part that's actually challenging for all of us as lawyers, and it's still a work in progress to really make sure that we facilitate the knowledge around the legal process and the legal strategies so that the communities can make decisions around what claims should we pursue, what legal strategies should we pursue, because they're the ones who understand what is the problem we're trying to solve, and as Wally pointed out, who are the people that we need to influence to resolve this problem, because a lot of times it's not just getting a court order. So in this case, we use this example in many ways because this was an important lesson for us as attorneys at Beyond. Francisco was initially denied bond because of DUI, and for immigration practitioners and non-immigration practitioners, over the past few years, the Attorney General has really severely hindered immigration rights, the rights of immigrants when DUI is involved. So cancellation of removal has specifically been denied by the Attorney General in decisions saying you can deny cancellation of removal based upon DUI. So this case is coming at a really difficult time when the administration is attacking and utilizing DUI to deny immigrants rights in immigration court. So we knew that it was, we lost the bond hearing already once, but because of everything that was going on with Francisco in detention and his family and the organizing goals of OCAD, OCAD came to us and said, we want to ask for a bond redetermination. We want to ask this question to the judge of why Francisco should be in detention, given all the support that he has from the community, all the trauma and psychological damage being caused to his son, who's dealing with very severe trauma, including suicidal ideation as a result of Francisco's detention. So being the immigration attorneys that we are, we said to OCAD, well, we don't think that's a good idea because we've already lost once. The law is against us, and we don't want to piss off the judge, because part of legal strategy that we have as litigators is to really not impact the relationship with the judge, because the judge has so much discretion. So, you know, the typical lawyering litigation recommendations and ideas that most lawyers would have in this situation. And OCAD said, well, we understand, we appreciate what you're telling us, but based upon what's happening, we want to pursue it. We think it's necessary to support Francisco's family, to mobilize the community. We want to do it. So because of our model of doing community-driven litigation, by deferring even litigation strategy to our community partners, we proceeded to do the hearing. And during that hearing, OCAD packed the courts with family members, and OCAD worked with Francisco's son to speak about what was going on for him and his family. And in such powerful testimony from the community, and particularly Francisco's son, the judge was forced to hear just the inhumanity of what's going on, forced to hear just how horribly impacted that this detention was having on the family and the community, and at the same time hear very openly all the community support, not only in terms of the packing of the courts, but also in the testimony that was available to Francisco to deal with some of the substance abuse issues that he was facing. So the judge actually denied the bond hearing. Denied the bond redetermination. So we had 2 strikes against bond. However, a few months later, we then had the cancellation of removal individual hearing. Again, OCAD packed the courts, OCAD prepared Francisco and other witnesses, community supporters who would say if Francisco is bonded, he would have all the support he needed. And we actually won. And I say that we actually, because the law really was against us. And I can tell you that, so I was not the attorney who did the hearing. The attorney who did the hearing, when she got the decision, actually texted me a message saying, I'm in utter shock. This was a pure act of judicial activism that only happened, and we know this because the judge actually cited it was because of the community support that persuaded him that Francisco could overcome his challenges with DUI. So I wanted to stop there, but I really the story is just, we're better lawyers. Like, we grow and become and learn to more effectively litigate because we were not limiting ourselves to what we knew about what the law is or how the court works. And we were open to listening and deferring to what OCAD told us. So with that, I think we're going to move on to the next slide around lessons that we've learned together.
And I'll get us started. So I think one of the first lessons learned after we had a debrief conversation, all of us together, was to create a media communication plan. And this is really important, right? You want to understand kind of any type of litigation, documentation, that is, or legal tactic that is going to be submitted, and that needs to be presented to the organizers so that they're also amplifying it in media platforms such as like social media, like Facebook and Instagram, in order to make sure that it's not just the courts or the legal system that is getting this tactic, right, but the public is also getting updated, and that you can also start mobilizing them for other organizational tactics for the campaign itself. With that, we'll move on to the second point.
And I can speak briefly about streamlining communications. You know, often in these cases, you may have 4 lawyers from Beyond and 4 or more organizers from OCAD all working on a case together, and that is awesome because you have all this support, but it also means that it's really hard to communicate effectively, especially when, you know, if you're moving at the speed of trust, things are going to take 2 or 3 times as long, because that's what it takes to really make a connection and understand one another. So good to know who to call in an emergency when it's like we have to do something now. We don't have a day to schedule a call altogether, but at the same time, just investing in enough time to bring everyone together and talk and make a decision. You know, just as you owe the same duties as you always owe to your client to keep them informed and respect them as decision maker, like there's a lot. So just like anticipating that need and communicating early and often and putting everyone together is what I found to be helpful in our work together.
Yeah, and those points, I would add that to also work as a team, right? As organizers, we have a perspective, the lawyers have another perspective, and then the families that are making ultimately the decisions around risk taking and what they need to also feel heard and empowered through this whole process. As OCAD and Beyond, we have always tried to have the strategy meetings together and consult each other and brainstorm what are the next steps, run through what we're going to do with each other, making sure that there's no flags that need to be raised or concerns. But I think it's working, communicating all of those intricacies. I think as OCAD, we've also feel like we've learned a lot. We've been doing this since 2010, 2009 as IJL, and then as OCAD since 2013. Oftentimes just helping people when they can't have legal representation. So I would say, like, trust the organizers. I think we can bring communication and being transparent with each other has been really useful. And then on determining compatible levels of aggression for organizing and legal strategy, I think it has been mentioned that sometimes we feel like we know who needs to be exposed or pressured because they are the ones holding that decision that impacts that person's life. So I know for us, we might be organizing a press conference and talking about, what that would take and asking people to either sign a petition or make calls or be present. And then we see the legal team also, talking to the other side of the litigation and trying to also push there. So I think there's things that we have to strategize together and support each other around.
And just to elaborate on what Xanat said, there are a couple of ways I think about this. I think an early piece of advice we got in Beto's case is that to get a good result, you really have to be the squeaky wheel, because you can go into court, but then what you do in court, and I think you can think about, like, sometimes litigation is like, I've never run a marathon, so this is a bad analogy, but it's like the tempo really matters. There are times when you want to be sprinting, because when you think about who your decision maker is and what it's going to take to get them to make the right decision, you want now, push, push, push. And there are other times when you want to slow down, when you want to say, we're not at that moment yet. And so just sort of a combination of, like, that means sometimes to move aggressively, you might be in front of a judge and say, your shame reflexes kick in, and it's like, am I being a bad child? Am I asking for an unreasonable thing? And like, you know, sometimes you have to be the bad kid because like the bad kid gets a lot of attention, and sometimes that's what it takes to move it. So just like that level of like aggression and knowing when to speed things up can make a huge difference, and it's part of having a coordinated strategy.
One thing I want to add in terms of the strategies that are used is this idea of the judicial process. I think one of the reasons that community-driven litigation is so effective is particularly in the immigration space, is because the law is not necessarily good. Like a lot of the work that we're doing, and the reason why OCAD and beyond is doing our work in these spaces is because the law is bad and it needs to be changed. And how can we change it if we always just stick to what we're told is decorum or what we're told is professional, and we want to respect judges when that process is actually really stacked against a lot of the communities we work with. So I think what's so powerful about organizers and organizing strategies, and when you combine them with litigation, is it gives us an opportunity to say, you know, if we go and use the standard procedure and just respect that there's this judge who's going to make all these decisions, we're going to lose. So we have to do something different. We have to really disrupt that process. And what I mean by that is, going back to the Francisco example that I mentioned, one of the things that happened as a result of OCAD packing the courts was the judge started having extra security. They started implementing these procedures to limit who could come into the court. So then OCAD, I remember, had to respond by creating the system whereby the people would start rotating into the court because the judge was trying to block this show of solidarity. Clearly, it's having an impact. It had an impact in his decision, but it was also having an impact on how he's thinking and understanding this, because he now sees, look, not only do I have to deal with the quote unquote merits of the case, but I have to recognize that there's this community that's bombarding my courtroom to show support, and that had to have an impact. Similarly, one of the things that we did was the judge had a lot of concerns around Francisco's son and providing testimony because of how traumatic it was. And the judge was really preventing us during one of our hearings to listening to Francisco's son. And that was, and you know, it was the court procedure, and he didn't want to have it before the merits hearing. So what we did was we asked for an opportunity for Francisco's son to speak to his father in detention, because they had set up the remote video conferencing network to allow Francisco to testify during one of the hearings. So we asked, obviously, you know, very, very politely, but we managed to let the judge let Francisco speak to his son in the courtroom after the hearing was over. And I can tell you, the hearing just how much pain Francisco and his son were dealing with, and hearing them cry as they were missing each other, was probably one of the most powerful legal strategies that we could have used. And it only happened because we forced the judge to listen in a way that he didn't expect. Like, he thought he had prevented Francisco's son from testifying during the regular court process. But in order for Francisco to speak to his son in the courtroom, the judge was actually sitting there. And so there was this conversation, just a conversation between a father and son. And hearing that was one of the most effective evidentiary tools that we had in the case. And I think that's something that's so important, is a lot of times the judicial process discourages, eliminates, or really overly regulates the voice of the people whose stories lawyers are trying to tell. And why are we the ones to telling these stories? It should really be the people who owns the story, who are experiencing it. And so how can we disrupt that and just change this idea of decorum or professionalism to make sure that judges are actually hearing what they should be hearing in a way that's much more authentic than what lawyers and direct testimony or cross-examinations can get out. Next slide, please. I think, oh, I'm sorry, is there, was there anything else that everyone wanted to add? Oh, next slide, thanks.
Yes, and when we also, as we continue to collect the lessons learned, right, organizers need transparency from the legal team. It is not strictly about reviewing all content and motions and filings, but to know when, how, and why something is being submitted, to coordinate events and communications to make a bigger impact. This kind of goes back to the point, right, that sometimes there is good litigation that is carried on by amazing attorneys inside the courts. But whenever there's no community component, there's always a misuse opportunity to amplify the wins within the course, right, of that good litigation. And so what we're trying to do here is to really unify these two forces, these two strategies, both organizing and legal, to combine each other in order to really create movements and movement building, right? Any other point?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, Antonio, I think given the organizers an opportunity to see and use the moments, to celebrate the moments, highlight the awful moments, challenge movement to do better or tackle those issues. I think, and throughout campaigns, individual campaigns, we try to also identify moments where we have the conversation around Beto, we have the conversation around Francisco, and sometimes that is a filing, and sometimes that is just a master hearing that might feel insignificant, but I think with the organizer's perspective, thinking about what the community needs to know, how we need to keep departments accountable, I think that's critical. Giving the organizers the opportunity to kind of use those moments strategically.
And to give an example around this, where I think there's also very much a mutually reinforcing benefits of this transparency. I was at a meeting on Tuesday, which involved a training around momentum organizing, which I don't know a ton about, but one of the principles in it is that when you're fighting an organizing campaign, generally, there's a struggle for narrative, and getting your message across in which, you know, in Beto's case is about, among other things, ICE's misconduct is leading to this man's deportation, and they're violating the law in doing so. And but it's also about his role as a caretaker and as a brother and son and grandson and community member. That narrative can go either way, both publicly and in the courts, right? And so we had a discovery dispute, which wouldn't necessarily be something that you thought would make a lot of, but the discovery dispute is about whether ICE will get to hide evidence from the judge and the public, right? Which is also about ICE's failure to follow its own procedures. And so things that seem smaller or more procedural can contribute to the narrative, and also coming back into the case, knowing, you know, how you appear, you know, that making the injustice big enough for the judge to say, I want to hear what happens, I want to see this play out, versus get these troublemakers out of my court, or whatever else the judge might think. Like, it's a continuing battle. And the more you are sharing that information, the more everyone has to work with and win the fight for a narrative. I can also say a little bit on the next one about taking the time to train each other. I think one thing that has been true in this case and in other cases is that organizers come to the table with national connections to other organizers and other good lawyers who have worked with organizers. And many of the ideas we used in this case were, like most good legal work, plagiarized from somewhere else and relying heavily on OCAD's connections. But likewise, taking the time to say, here's what's happening next. And for me, it gets back to who's your target and what are you trying to get them to decide? Because there is a, you know, what does the law say and how might a judge rule? But that's only a small piece of the story, right? Very little litigation ends in a judge's definitive ruling. And so it's not just, you know, what are legal arguments, but what's the tactical what's this battlefield we're on with the judges and the ICE lawyers and the administrative agencies, and what are the different moves we can make and what moves will they make, right? And it's negotiations, it's press, it's what happens in court, it's a lot of different fields. And I think we spend a lot of time just trying to understand where we are and where are we trying to go. And all of it strengthens the work on every angle of it.
Speaking on be prepared for the worst case scenario and don't be afraid to ask questions. I think encouraging also organizers to if something that's not clear, something you need to clarify so that you as a team can strategize around. I think it's just as important to be empowered to do so. I think we always are hopeful and know that bad things will happen and we're going to have to call them out and use that moment also to honor what happened to the individual. So I think exploring all possibilities is important as organizers, being ready to tackle those injustices and using that moment for important conversations and important next steps that we need to take to ratify those things. And as organizers, know that you are key to this, and as a result, don't be afraid to ask questions, to challenge the whole process with your legal team.
I can also speak about being honest about your limitations, but also being committed to learning. We did a lot of things that I think as a firm, but definitely me as a lawyer, had never done before in Beto's case. And that's something that we actually do fairly often in community lawyer partnerships and campaigns. And Lam spoke earlier about part of our model is vulnerability. And it's when you tell either a partner or a client, I have never done this before, I'm just starting to learn about this, that's part of it. But then it's also figuring out how am I going to learn about it, right? And talking to other lawyers, talking to organizers who have worked with lawyers, reviewing case law decisions, and especially lawsuits by similarly situated persons who have tried to accomplish similar goals. I was on a webinar about movement lawyering recently where they talk about, not just about the speed of trust idea, but also the importance of doing really excellent legal work. That part of how you build trust is that you try to come to meetings where you're making the big decisions, having exhausted many or all of the possibilities you can come up with. And as Lam's pointed out, that doesn't mean you have all the ideas either. We have a lot of meetings and conversations where we don't know what the best idea is, and new ideas come up in the conversations that we have. But it's a lot of it is just doing the work and doing it proactively and thoroughly. And that's how you put yourself in a position where you can be the right kind of collaborator. And I think if you come in with not just your limitations, but also your roadmap of what you plan to do and how, and then you follow through, at times, as people new to a certain kind of case, we do things that other practitioners are too smart to try, and then we get good results doing them, right? So there are advantages to showing up that way too.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add one thing to what Wally said, which is one of the worst things that you can be as a lawyer is to actually raise expectations and present overconfidence that you can't meet. And we've definitely had failures that we've either been involved with or we're directly engaged in where we oversold what we could do. And I think that's worse. Being honest and saying, I don't know, is going to build more trust. And maybe, I think it's completely valid for the community partners to say, well, we'd rather go with someone who has more experience. But that's what's important, is they can make that decision. But when you go in and you oversell what you can do or oversell what's possible and things fall apart because you can't meet those expectations, that's when the trust really becomes damaged, and it's really difficult to recover from that.
Mhm. And to that, we get to our last point, right, of lessons learned, which is to create trust and to see one another as human beings, right? As we continue the work by humanizing the stories of those that we're fighting for, we also need to humanize one another and maybe even hang out outside like our regular meetings to coordinate strategy and tactics and understand each other's values and why we're all in that table, right? Because if you don't have that trust, then it's going to be really hard to work together. But with that, I think, unless there's a final comment from other panelists, we'll move on to the next slide. And now, well, thank you all of you, and we'll start getting some of your questions.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone again. I've popped back up. Wow, that was really, I mean, I know all of you, and I kind of had a sense of what you were all going to share, but I mean, that was really special. So thank you for your vulnerability and the humility with which you spoke about your work, for the wisdom. There was a lot of threads in there, and we have some questions that I'm going to share that kind of touch upon the idea of humanizing what is a very terrorizing system and conditions. Discussions around disruption, around depowering, and the opposite of that, understanding who holds power and trusting folks who are deep in this work to do that mapping, and then using key moments and the phrase that's come up. And there was actually a question around moving at the speed of trust. I think, Wally, you raised that a few times, and so there was a question from someone in the audience around what that means. And so you touched upon it briefly, Wally, but why don't we start with that, and then I'll come back with a question that was directed to Lom, but I think really would speak to all of you. Wally, can you just share a little bit what you mean by moving at the speed of trust?
Definitely. And just to set the context, I don't know exactly, I believe Organized Communities Against Deportation was one of Beyond Legal Aid's first partners, and we had our 5-year anniversary, some months ago. And so just, as a relatively new attorney in this partnership, I came to a relationship where there was a lot of trust already, and that was the level of accountability. So it would look different starting a new partnership for the first time. But I guess I mean a few things by that. And once you're in it, and you may have a case going, you may have deadlines, you may have fast-paced organizing. You can't necessarily slow down some of the things that are coming, but you can spend longer communicating, being transparent in ways we've talked about, taking time to explain and answer questions. I think one of the things that can be so harmful to that trust is when, as a lawyer, you see a deadline or a hearing coming up and you think, I'm just going to run with that. I've done that before, that's not a big deal. And then your client and or your partners may be surprised by developments in the case or feel like they're playing catch up on it. And it's just, it sort of is, it seems like an addition to the work, but it just is the work to communicate enough and make enough space and time for that kind of transparency and exchange. But I think, and if we have time, something I'd love Antonio and Xanat's perspectives on. I feel like, as a lawyer who just started my practice in Chicago a couple of years ago, I've tried to practice being sort of responsive, sensitive to bringing forward concerns that organizers have in collaborating with lawyers, that building trust is about how your partners and your clients feel about your work together and feel about how you're communicating with them. And so I think a piece of it is just, are you behaving like the arrogant, whatever lawyers that honestly these partners have probably worked with in the past, right? We are not the first or the last lawyers to partner with many of our community partners. Are you showing signs that you're going to collaborate in the right way? And are you spending the time to make sure? And I'd be interested if you all have thoughts on what you look for in lawyer partners and what are signals that people should be thinking about important to give in those collaborations.
Yeah, definitely. I think for us, when we decide that we're gonna fight alongside this an individual and make a public campaign, we identify that it fits within movement work, and also in order for it to be helpful to movement work, we need to be able to have a say in what happens, or at least be in the know of what happens in the courts, so that we can correctly advocate or use the moments, the critical moments. And so definitely we can tell when it's gonna be possible and not. When the lawyers generally see us as a team or as a group that they can use for logistical support or a nuisance. So I think we want to make sure that we're teamed with people that see us and respect their work, and respect the individual's decision to have an organizing team, to bring the case public, to take risks, to respect their risk taking, not overprotect, because sometimes risk taking can take us to new levels, new opportunities, new wins.
Great. This question came through for Lam, but I think it really applies to all of you. And it's around this idea of problem solving, Lam, that you talked about, which is really at the heart of some of the work that lawyers and those engaging in legal battles are dealing with. And so when you're trying to move power from the courts, to where it should be, which is in community, and you're dealing with bureaucracy, legal jargon, kind of technocratic, deliberately designed difficult things for people to understand, how do you do that? Like, what does that process look like? And I think for folks at OCAD, it seems like a lot of the work you're doing is not only kind of understanding the harms that your members and your communities are facing, but kind of serving as translators, like translating things that are happening in the courts, in your meetings, to the folks who are, involved in these cases. And so how are you doing that work? Because we heard a lot about the role of kind of relationships between organizers and lawyers. We haven't heard so much about kind of the community members whose cases you are working with and kind of their role in some of these advocacy campaigns and cases.
So I can start. I think for us, the most immediate response is the decision making. And as I mentioned, one of the challenges for us is, it's much easier to have a community partner, an organization most of the time, make a decision around what cases to take or what priorities or eligibility. It's more of a challenge to get community members, non-attorneys, and whether it be a community member whose case we're working on or a community member who's a community organizer, to make litigation decisions. So I think that's something that is very much an ongoing process for us, how to do it effectively, how to ensure that the language is translated and interpreted properly, so that there's power in the very act of saying, use this litigation strategy versus use another litigation strategy. And if we can get to the place where, whether it be a community member whose individual divorce or housing case can make that decision, or it be a community organizer helping us make that decision, I think that's a great starting point. More logistically, I think a lot of it has to do with, it really is opening up the courts and making the courts much more democratic. And because I think when I speak about problem solving, I really think about how many times when I was a legal aid lawyer, before Beyond, I would have people come in who would have problems. And then we'd start talking about, oh, so your problem is, let's say you want, I'm going to use a non-immigration case because a lot of my work before Beyond was non-immigration, but a lot of times let's say it's an issue with a landlord, a dispute with a landlord. And we would talk about, so what is it that you would like? And what would you like to see happen? And they would often say, well, I'd like, for example, my heat to work as soon as possible because it's freezing cold and I have no heat in my apartment. And so we talk through, well, here's what I can do as a lawyer. And I'll say, well, I can file this affirmative action. We could potentially get we can probably get a TRO if I file a motion for a temporary restraining order, but here are all the documents you have to get me. Here's all the things I have to prove. and they'll say, oh wait, that means it's going to take like 4 weeks. The winter is going to be over before I can get my heat on. What if I can you call my landlord and talk to him? And I would call the landlord, and lo and behold, the heat comes on. But the idea came from the person who already has a much better sense of what's going on. So what we try to do is really try to get the court process and the legal process to open up and to get more of the people who are directly impacted into that space. And an example that we have actually with one of our other partners is so often when we do negotiations, lawyers don't want organizers in the space. They don't want, often they don't even want the community members in the space, even though they're the ones who are making the final decision. And judges, don't, as I said, often don't want them to be hearing this. They just want to hear from lawyers. So what we really want to do is, how do we make sure more and more people who are non-attorneys can speak in these forums? And it's been powerfully effective when we've been able to get faster resolutions and stronger settlements when it's not lawyers talking back and forth with each other, or lawyers talking to judges. So I'll stop there as a couple of examples from our legal work.
Great. And then anyone at OCAD kind of want to respond to the question around community translation, community member engagement in this work, and kind of your approach to that?
Yeah, I think, well, we always ask a lot of questions. We are not lawyers, and we tell people that come for support on our side that we're not lawyers, but we can try to figure out things together and ask many, many questions. I think aside from the conversations that we have with the legal team and asking questions there, we'll also have internal meetings and try to see what we didn't understand, and then ask again what we didn't understand as a collective, to then assess our own strategies. So I encourage that. And also, as lawyers team up with organizers, like, you want to meet organizers that want to learn and ask the questions, right? I think we need to be able to challenge each other. So I think for us, it's a process of many, many questions, conversations, and then questions again, as we ourselves have internal conversations around strategy and how do we see ourselves useful.
And then I will also add, right, that as OCAD, we like to think of ourselves as a community organization, right? We're doing organizing and empowerment of undocumented immigrants. And that also institutes how we communicate that in the first intake with an individual, right? They understand that we're not just gonna be able to solve their problem, that we're gonna have to do it collectively, and that we're gonna have a lot of questions. And then, yes, we're gonna problem solve with both attorneys, with organizers, and at the end of the day, is their decision, is their risk. And then they get also be put into one of our committees, right? So right now we have an Assembly committee that kind of puts together the content, and then also participation of members into our community meetings, which are co-asambleas. And they also form another group or another committee called Luchadores, which is all the individuals that have filed some kind of deportation case, whether it was a family member of their own, and whether that case is still currently active or whether they already won through the work that they've been doing with OCAD, right? And so there's an intentionality about how the problem solving itself is going to be presented to them, how much power they get within the process of determining their own decision, and as a result, then they get empowered to then be advocates and supporters of the next future campaign that we're going to take on as OCAD as well.
Sukti, could I have 2 seconds just to add a really funny story, but powerful story about problem solving?
Go for it.
This is actually a story that Antonio's familiar with, because this is one of the other organizations Antonio's involved with. But one of our housing partners, we had this case where the goal was to get a landlord to fix these issues and deal with some conditions violations that were happening. And so I come to court one day, and the lawyer comes in, and I was expecting to do I think we were going to argue over some sort of motion. And the lawyer's like, we're ready to settle because our community partner, the Autonomous Tenants Union, had gone in, taken pictures of all the conditions violations and created postcards of them and sent the postcards to the landlord. And so the landlord received all these postcards that had been created from the conditions violations in the in the building. And so I didn't have to do any work. I literally came in to basically finalize a legal settlement because the problem had been solved by these amazing postcards, which I was like, can I figure out how we can start doing them from our legal team, and can we ethically do it?
That's awesome. The last point touches on another question that came, that it's long, and I think there's a lot here that I would love to share, but because of time constraints, it's basically saying if we all kind of fundamentally agree that immigration law is bad, and I think Lam, you touched upon this, and I think all of us here agree with that. Are you seeing community members wanting to actually engage in the arguments that are challenging the underlying laws themselves? Like, do you see community members saying, okay, we know precedent sucks. What can we do to actually engage much more intentionally with the law itself and kind of challenge it? Are you seeing that from folks, or is it still like you're just kind of reacting and it's very much in emergency mode, so it's hard to kind of have some of those more intentional inquiries on the underlying legality of the law themselves? I
would say that we know that as a community, that the law as it is, or the system as it is set against us, right? It's set to justify displacement of our people, our everyday life existence here in Chicago. We see criminalization and the treatment of people of color being a trigger for all of the harms. And so I think those conversations are there. I think we are trying to figure out how to disrupt, and we learn how to disrupt by seeing the nuances of individual cases or campaigns. We inform ourselves as to what policy ordinances we need to push to tackle the dismantling of the larger agency. I think we're aware that things need to be chipped and things need to be tweaked for us to survive this moment, but also we're actively creating networks of people talking about what liberation looks like for us, what we ultimately need. We need to build power with each other and connect with each other, and so that work is happening. I think we go into litigation and immigration proceedings knowing that it's not set up for us to win or find justice, but we're gonna try to disrupt it. We're gonna try to expose it. We're gonna try to create consciousness, greater consciousness with more people as we battle and see the inadequacy of it.
Great. I have 2 more questions and we have 3 minutes. So anyone want, I'll just read them out and then feel free to jump in and any lasting comments. One is around changing of mindsets. So I think there's 2 perspectives. One is that people are really liking the reframing of the approach that you all have kind of presented to folks out in the ether land of whatever it is we're in. What's the resistance? Like, have you experienced resistance from other lawyers, beyond team, of kind of advocating this approach to lawyering? And from the organizing perspective, there's sometimes a suspicion of working with lawyers because of some of the things we've talked about. And so what have been successful approaches to kind of changing mindsets so this type of partnership and this type of community-driven litigation can really expand and grow and become more of the norm rather than more of the aberration?
I mean, as organizers, we try to remind each other that lawyers are a tool to what we're seeking, not the only tool. And so to keep being creative and find the lawyers that will be creative with you and respect you. So I think keep looking for the right match to challenge those things. And also don't let, when there's a lawyer aspect present, don't let that dim your light or your ability to speak on the subject. I know as OCAD, when we share space, we're very aware that in a space, the questions will go to the lawyers and the focus will go, the attention will go to lawyers. And so we often have to strategize together and say, hey, if this comes in, we take it, or don't speak beyond this amount of time, or we're going to make sure that we do community agreements as to what this space is about. It's not about legal consultations or, you know, so it's often like, do the team, make the team where you can, you know, work together as equals, I would say.
Super.
And then from the Beyond's perspective, you know, this is actually the entire purpose of our organization, which is to try to convince other lawyers to do work in this way. But I would say, I actually am optimistic. I do think when I speak to other lawyers and other legal aid organizations, there is a genuine commitment to be better, to go beyond where they are with working with communities. And I think everything that's happened over the past 4 years has really shown just how ineffective the law can be sometimes, and how there's so much more need for grassroots organizing and activism to be part of the conversation. So I'm optimistic about that. I think the resistance we get are twofold. One is, this is really different. It's not a legal education. And I actually think particularly legal aid is founded upon this notion of this sort of heroic notion of who's deserving of our help, who we're gonna save. And I think that's sort of that mindset of shifting from saving to collaboration is the challenge. And as an ED, I think the other challenge is the capacity and resources, and how do I convince other legal aid organization EDs to say, you know, here's how to do it logistically without affecting your budget. And you have all these grants. You're funded by the government, so half the work that we want you to do, you can't do because you're funded by the government. So there are genuine logistics and financial considerations and practical considerations that we really have to fight against. But I think, as I said, I think this is really the moment for us to be pushing the conversation in changing the language and changing the conversations to this model, as opposed to the traditional model that lawyers are so used to.
Great. So yeah, the last slide is to highlight, you know, thank you so much to Ian for helping us host this conversation and being, you know, a fabulous partner through the process. And major gratitude and thanks to all of you at OCAD and beyond for not only being with us today, for really profoundly for the work that you do that is so important. And if you want to learn more, I sound like I'm selling something, but do check out the justicepower.org website. There was a question around, if you're a law student, you want to learn more, reach out to us. Our email is on the website, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation. You know, we'll be back in a couple months with another teach-in on another strategy, and look forward to much more of this. And back to you, Pat.
Thank you all. Thank you to Organized Communities Against Deportations, Beyond Legal Aid, and Justice Power for your time and your expertise today. And thank you to the audience for joining us. For a recorded version of today's webinar, check back next week on www.immigrationadvocates.org in the webinars section of our nonprofit resource center. Access is free to members, and membership is free to nonprofit staff and pro bono lawyers. If you're not a member already, we hope that you will join us.
Bye, everybody.